My name is Bella. I'm 34 years old, and I'm the chief financial officer of a mid-sized logistics company in Ashcombe, Ohio, a job I built from an entry-level bookkeeping desk over 11 years. I was disowned by my husband's family the week I married him, and 8 years later, the same man who called me a gold-digging nobody from a trailer park stood on my porch in a coat 2 sizes too big, asking me for $60,000 so he wouldn't lose his house. "You'll regret marrying that girl," my father-in-law told my husband the night before our wedding. "She'll bring you down to her level." I remember the exact words because I was standing behind the kitchen door when he said them, holding a casserole dish I'd made for the rehearsal dinner, and I remember setting it down very quietly so no one would hear the clink of the ceramic against the counter. If you're watching this right now, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and in the comments tell me what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one. Some of you have been with me since the first video, and if you're new here, welcome. You're about to hear the whole story, start to finish, no skip parts. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because none of what happened on that porch 8 years later makes sense unless you understand where I came from and who I married into. I grew up in Millbrook, a town about 40 minutes outside Ashcombe with one stoplight and a Dollar General that doubled as the social hub. My mother worked double shifts at a diner called the Copper Kettle, and my father wasn't really in the picture past the age of 6. We lived in a 2-bedroom rental on 3rd Street, and I shared a room with my younger sister, Callie, until I was 17. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because it matters for what comes later, because the Hargrove family made my background the centerpiece of every insult they ever threw at me, and I want you to understand exactly what kind of life I actually built out of that starting point. I met Daniel Hargrove in September of 2015 in an accounting class at Ashcombe State, both of us 23, both of us grinding through night classes while working full-time. He was quiet in a way that made you lean in to listen, and he had this habit of doing the math in his head before the professor finished writing the problem on the board. We started studying together at a coffee shop called Miller's on Route 9, and by December we were together. By the following spring, I'd met his parents exactly twice, and both times his mother, Diane, looked at my shoes like she was doing an appraisal. The Hargroves were not obscenely wealthy, but in Ashcombe, they were considered old money. Daniel's father, Richard Hargrove, owned a chain of 3 hardware stores that had been in the family since 1974, worth somewhere around $2.1 million on paper, and the family had a certain standing in the community, the kind where people said the Hargroves, the way you'd say a title. Richard was the president of the Rotary Club for 6 years running. Diane sat on the board of the Ashcombe Historical Society. They had a house on Larkspur Lane with a wraparound porch and a Cadillac Escalade in the driveway that Richard washed himself every Sunday like it was a religious ritual. And then there was Daniel's older brother, Marcus. Marcus Hargrove was 2 years older than Daniel, and from the moment I walked into that family, it was obvious Marcus was the son they built their whole identity around. Marcus had gone to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, dropped out after 2 years to pursue entrepreneurship, and had been living in his parents' finished basement for 6 years running 3 different failed businesses, a car detailing service, a t-shirt printing company, and at the time I enter the picture, something called Hargrove Ventures, that as far as I could ever tell never generated a single dollar of actual revenue. Richard had given Marcus $40,000 in seed money over those 6 years, in increments of $5,000 and $10,000, always described as an investment, never once called a loan, never once expected back. Daniel, meanwhile, had put himself through community college, then transferred to Ashcombe State, and was working 30 hours a week at a warehouse while carrying a full course load. He never got a dime from his parents. Not for tuition, not for his car when it broke down in the winter of 2016, not for anything. When I asked him about it once, early on, he just shrugged and said, "Marcus needs it more than I do. I can handle myself." That sentence told me everything about the shape of that family, and it would take his parents 8 more years to say it to my face the way Daniel had already lived it his whole life. Diane made her first real comment about me at Thanksgiving in 2016. We were in the kitchen, and I'd offered to help with the dishes, and she looked at my hands. I still had a faint grease stain on my thumb from fixing my car's alternator that morning, something I'd learned to do myself because I couldn't afford a mechanic, and she said, "You know, Daniel could really do so much better for himself." He's always been the responsible one. It would be a shame for that to go to waste. I didn't say anything. I dried a plate and put it in the cabinet. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to from the spring of 2017 that I think explains the whole family better than anything else could. Marcus had just shut down his car detailing business, the second failed venture, after running up $6,800 in unpaid vendor bills, and instead of any kind of reckoning, Richard threw him a fresh start, dinner at a steakhouse in downtown Ashcombe, the Ironwood Grill, where a ribeye ran $58 a plate. I wasn't invited, obviously. I wasn't family yet in their eyes, but Daniel went, and he came home that night and told me Richard had stood up mid-meal and given a toast to Marcus's resilience. Daniel had been managing 3 warehouse shifts a week around a full-course load at the time, making his own tuition payments of $410 a month, and no one had ever once toasted him for anything. I bring that up because it's the emotional math that mattered. It wasn't that the Hargroves didn't love Daniel. I think, in their own limited way, they did. It's that love in that house was distributed like a reward system, and Daniel had made the mistake of being competent and self-sufficient in a family that only knew how to notice you when you needed rescuing. Marcus needed rescuing constantly, so Marcus got attention, money, forgiveness, toasts at steakhouses. Daniel needed nothing, so Daniel got nothing, until the one time he needed something for himself, which was permission to marry the woman he loved, and even that request was treated as a debt he owed them first. By 2018, Daniel and I were engaged. He proposed on the pier at Lake Erie on July 14th with a ring he'd saved for over 11 months, $2,200, bought with his own warehouse paychecks because he refused to ask his father for a dime toward it. When we told his parents, Richard didn't say congratulations. He said, "Are you sure about this, son?" Directly to Daniel, like I wasn't standing 3 feet away. The wedding was set for June 2019. And this is where the trigger event happened, the moment that everything after it hinges on. In April of that year, 6 weeks before the wedding, Richard called Daniel into his office at the main hardware store, the flagship location on Route 9, and told him he wanted Daniel to co-sign a loan. Not a small one. Richard was trying to open a 4th store, expand into the neighboring county, and the bank wanted a second guarantor because Richard's existing debt load was already stretched thin from years of propping up Marcus's ventures. The loan was for $180,000. Richard wanted Daniel's name on it, and this is the part that made my stomach turn when Daniel told me Richard also wanted us to postpone the wedding by a year until the business stabilizes because he didn't want financial distractions complicating things. Daniel said no. He said no because he'd seen exactly what an investment in Marcus had looked like for 6 straight years, and he wasn't going to sign his name to $180,000 of debt for a store expansion built on the same shaky math. He said no because he loved me, and he wasn't postponing our wedding for anyone. He came home that night and told me what happened, and I remember him sitting at our kitchen table, a second-hand table we bought for $40 at a church sale, with his jaw tight, saying, "I told him no, Bella. I told him I'm not doing that to you. Not to us." I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because a lot of people expect this part of the story to be about tears, and it wasn't. I felt something colder and steadier than that, a kind of clarity. I told Daniel I was proud of him, and I meant it, and I had no idea yet how much that one word, no, was about to cost us. 2 weeks later, on May 3rd, 2019, at 6:40 in the evening, Richard and Diane showed up at our apartment unannounced. We were renting a 1-bedroom above a laundromat on Cedar Street at the time, $650 a month, and I remember the smell of fabric softener drifting up through the floor vents while Richard stood in our tiny living room in his Rotary Club windbreaker and told his son that if Daniel married me, he was no longer welcome at Larkspur Lane. Not at Christmas, not at Sunday dinners, not ever. "You're choosing her over your own family," Diane said, and her voice didn't even shake. "Over Marcus. Over everything we built for you boys." Daniel asked what exactly he was supposed to be choosing over her. Diane said, "A future. A real one. Not whatever this is." And she gestured at our apartment, the second-hand table, the mismatched chairs, the futon we used as a couch, like it was evidence in a trial. Richard's line was the one I'll never forget, the one I quoted at the top of this video. He looked directly at me and said, "You'll regret marrying that girl. She'll bring you down to her level." Then he turned to Daniel and said, If you walk down that aisle with her, don't call this house again. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't cry either. He looked at his father for a long moment, and then he said, "Then I guess I won't call." And he walked to the door and held it open for them. They left. Diane's heels clicked down our narrow stairwell, and I remember the sound of the laundromat's dryers running below us. A strange, mundane soundtrack to the end of a family. Daniel closed the door, turned around, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not devastation, exactly, but a kind of quiet grief, the grief of someone setting down a weight he'd been carrying his whole life without knowing it was heavy. I walked over and put my hand on his chest, right over his heart, and I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "We're going to be fine. I promise you that." I want to pause here and say, if any of you have ever had to choose between a partner and a family that never really chose you back, drop a comment. I'd like to hear it. This part of the story is for you. We got married on June 22nd, 2019, at a small venue outside Millbrook called River Bend Hall with 38 guests, a $6,200 budget we'd saved ourselves, and my mother crying happy tears in the front row in a dress she bought on layaway. Not one Hargrove attended. Not Richard, not Diane, not Marcus. Daniel's aunt, his father's younger sister, sent a card with a check for $50 and a note that said, "I wish I could be there. Be well, both of you." That was the only contact from that entire side of the family for the next 2 years. The weeks after the wedding were strange in a way that's hard to describe if you haven't lived it. It wasn't loud grief. It was quiet. Daniel would sometimes pick up his phone out of habit, thumb hovering over his father's contact, and then just set it back down. He didn't talk about it much. I didn't push him. What I did instead was start something that would matter more than either of us understood at the time. I started keeping a folder. Just a plain manila folder at first, then eventually a 3-ring binder, where I saved everything. Every card, every text, every voicemail transcript, every receipt from that week in May, every detail. I told Daniel I was doing it for us, so that someday, if we ever needed to remember exactly what happened and in what order, we wouldn't be relying on memory alone. He thought I was being sentimental. I told him I was being careful. Both of those things were true. If there was one person who became our family in those early months, it was Daniel's manager at the warehouse, a woman named Patricia Ruiz, who was 58 years old, had run the logistics floor for 19 years, and had a habit of feeding anyone who walked into the office hungry, physically and otherwise. Patricia found out what had happened with Daniel's parents through a stray comment he made about not having anyone to invite to a family barbecue that summer, and without making a big production of it, she started inviting us to the Sunday dinners. Her husband, Hector, ran a small auto shop, and between the two of them, they had 4 grown kids and a house that was always loud and always warm. Patricia was the one who told Daniel about a management track opening in the warehouse's operations office. The one who wrote him a recommendation letter when he applied for a scholarship to finish his accounting certification at home. The one who sat at our kitchen table in September of 2019 and helped me build my very first real budget spreadsheet. The same kind of spreadsheet. Honestly, that would later turn into the financial modeling work that got me my first dinner with my boss. The first Sunday dinner at Patricia in Hector's house is one I still remember in detail. Their place was a modest 3-bedroom on Willow Street with a screened-in back porch, and Patricia made pernil that had been in the oven since 9 that morning, the smell of garlic and citrus hitting you the second you walked through the door. Their son Ray, 26 at the time and a mechanic at Hector's shop, spent half the dinner ribbing Daniel about his terrible taste in football teams, and their daughter Yesenia set an extra plate at the table without even asking, like it was assumed, like we'd always been coming to these dinners. Nobody appraised my shoes. Nobody asked what my father did for a living. Patricia just handed me a serving spoon and said, "You're on rice duty now, Mija, don't burn it." And something in my chest loosened that I hadn't realized was clenched tight since May 3rd. Hector, for his part, took a particular interest in Daniel once he found out Daniel had been quietly doing the books for his auto shop in his spare time, unpaid, just because he liked untangling Hector's chaotic invoicing system. "This kid," Hector told me once, tapping the side of his head, "thinks in numbers the way I think in engines." It was the kind of casual, offhand pride that Daniel had never once heard from his own father, and I watched him absorb it a little differently every time, like a plant finally getting light from the right direction. By the spring of 2020, those Sunday dinners had become the fixed point of our week, the thing we scheduled everything else around. Patricia never once asked us to explain what had happened with the Hargroves in detail. She only ever said, the first time Daniel tried to explain it, "You don't owe people access to you just because they share your blood. Family is who shows up." I wrote that line down in the binder too, on the inside cover, in case I ever needed reminding. By the end of 2019, I had that job, junior staff accountant at a logistics firm called Ferris & Cole, starting salary $38,500. Daniel moved into the operations office at his warehouse with a raise to $52,000. It wasn't much, but it was ours, built without a single dollar from Larkspur Lane, and there was something in that fact that felt less like loss and more like proof. Our apartment above the laundromat had a specific smell I still think about sometimes, Tide detergent and hot dryer lint, drifting up through a vent in the bathroom floor that never quite closed right. In the winter, the whole place smelled like fabric softener from 6 in the morning until close to midnight, and I used to joke that we lived inside a giant scented candle. We had one window air conditioning unit we only ran in the bedroom during the worst of July, a hand-me-down couch from Patricia's daughter with a permanent dent on the left cushion, and that kitchen table with one leg propped up on a folded coaster because we could never quite get it level. None of it was glamorous. All of it was ours. I remember one night in October of 2019, close to 11 o'clock, Daniel sitting across from me at that lopsided table doing math on the back of a grocery receipt. How many more months until we could afford a slightly bigger place? How many more shifts until his certification exam fee was covered? He looked up and said, "I keep waiting to feel like we made a mistake. And I don't. I really don't." I told him I didn't either. It was true then, and it stayed true through every year that followed. Even the hard ones, even the ones where the silence from Larkspur Lane felt less like an absence and more like a heartbreak. We didn't reach out to his parents, and they didn't reach out to us, aside from that one card from Daniel's aunt. Diane didn't call on Daniel's birthday that October. Richard didn't call when Daniel passed his accounting certification exam in February of 2020, the test he studied for at that same perfect kitchen table, flashcards spread out next to unpaid bills. I watched him earn every inch of ground he gained that year, and I watched him do it without once mentioning his father's name unless I brought it up first. There was one more piece of that first year I want to tell you about before I move forward, because it's the moment I look back on as the real turning point, not the confrontation on Cedar Street, but what came 3 days after it. Daniel's Aunt Susan, the one who'd sent the card and the $50 check, called him out of the blue on a Tuesday evening. She didn't apologize for her brother. She didn't try to smooth things over. She just said, "I don't agree with what Richard did, and I want you to know that. You're a good man, Daniel, and you married a good woman. Don't let anyone make you feel small for choosing your own life." Daniel cried after that call, the only time I saw him cry that entire year, not out of grief, but out of something closer to relief, the relief of being seen clearly by at least one person who shared his blood. Susan never became a regular presence. She lived 4 hours away in Columbus and had her own complicated relationship with Richard. But that one phone call mattered enough that it got its own page in the binder, dated, time-stamped, word for word as best I could remember it. By the time we rang in 2020, we'd settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like a foundation. I was 6 months into the job at Ferris & Cole, already being handed small client accounts to manage on my own. Daniel had his certification, his new title of operations coordinator, and a growing reputation on the floor as the guy who could make Patricia's spreadsheets actually balance. We started saving, slowly, methodically, $200 a month into an account I labeled, half-jokingly, Someday House Fund. We didn't talk about the Hargroves much anymore, not because the wound had closed, but because we both, without really discussing it, decided we weren't going to let their absence define the shape of our life. We were building something. It just happened to be something they weren't part of. We didn't know it yet, but that was only the beginning of the struggle years, the years where the silence from his family would stretch on and calcify into something almost permanent, where I would keep building that binder page by page, receipt by receipt, voicemail transcript by voicemail transcript. where Daniel and I would claw our way up from a $650 a month apartment above a laundromat into something neither of his parents believed two kids like us were capable of. And we definitely didn't know that 8 years later, almost to the month, the same man who stood in our living room and told his son not to call that house again would be the one standing on our porch in a coat 2 sizes too big, asking to come in. Year 1. That's how I've always marked it in my head, the way you'd mark a fiscal year instead of a calendar one. Year 1 of the silence ran from May 2019 to May 2020, and it was the hardest, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. No calls, no cards, aside from Susan's, no accidental run-ins at the grocery store, even though Ashcombe was small enough that you'd think it would happen eventually. Richard and Diane simply behaved as though Daniel had moved to another country, and some part of me kept waiting for the silence to crack, and it never did. I kept adding to the binder anyway. Bank statements showing our savings crawling upward, a printout of Daniel's certification, a photo of our first Thanksgiving at Patricia and Hector's house, because I decided a long time ago that if anyone ever tried to rewrite what happened to us, I would have the receipts, literally and figuratively, to prove otherwise. That first Christmas without them was strange in a way I hadn't braced for. Daniel had spent 26 Christmases at Larkspur Lane, in the same living room, under the same 12-foot tree Diane insisted on ordering fresh, every year from a farm outside Millersburg, and that December, our first as a married couple with no invitation anywhere, he stood in our tiny kitchen on Cedar Street peeling potatoes for a dinner we were hosting for exactly 2 people, and he said out of nowhere, "I keep thinking I should feel worse than I do." I asked him what he meant. He said, "I thought losing Christmas would feel like losing something. It just feels like a Tuesday." I think that was the moment I understood we were actually going to be okay, because grief that stops arriving on schedule is grief that's finished doing its worst work. Year 2, 2020 into 2021. This was the year the world shut down around everyone, and somehow, in the middle of a pandemic that took down businesses twice our size, Ferris and Cole kept me on and even shifted more responsibility my way, because half the senior staff took early retirement rather than adapt to remote auditing software. I taught myself 3 new accounting platforms in 4 months out of pure necessity, staying up past midnight some nights with tutorial videos playing on my laptop propped against a stack of textbooks, and by August of 2020, I'd been promoted to senior staff accountant, salary bumped to $51,000. Daniel's warehouse, meanwhile, became an essential business overnight, and he ended up managing a skeleton crew of 12 people through a shipping surge that saw volume increase by 340% in 6 weeks. His base salary climbed to $58,000, plus a retention bonus of $4,000 that January that we put entirely into the Someday House Fund, which by then had grown to $11,400. We got one piece of contact from the Hargroves that year, and it wasn't from Richard or Diane directly. It came through Marcus, of all people, a single text message on Daniel's birthday in October 2020 that read, "Happy birthday, man. Hope you are doing okay." No punctuation beyond that, no follow-up, nothing about how their parents were doing, nothing that invited a real conversation. Daniel stared at it for a long time before typing back a simple "thanks, you too." And that was the entire exchange. I saved a screenshot of it anyway. It went in the binder under a tab I'd started labeling cold contact, because even a text that thin told me something, that they knew Daniel's number hadn't changed, that they knew, somewhere in the back of their minds, that he still existed. We heard through Susan, much later, that Marcus's 4th venture, some kind of online sneaker resale business, had also collapsed that year, another round of Richard's money gone, this time closer to $22,000, and that Marcus had moved back into the Larkspur Lane basement for good, at 30 years old, still treated by his parents like a promising young man on the verge of his breakthrough. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. If anything, I felt a little sad for him, the way you feel about anyone who'd been taught his whole life that being rescued was the same thing as being loved. If you've ever kept something like that, a folder, a box, a drawer of proof, just in case, comment below and tell me what's in yours. I think more of you have one than you'd admit out loud. Year 3, 2021 into 2022, was when things really started to shift. I sat for my CPA exam that spring, all 4 sections, studying most nights after work at the same crooked kitchen table, though by then we'd finally replaced it with a secondhand one from a estate sale that Hector helped us haul up the stairs, Sturdy oak, $75, no wobble at all. Daniel quizzed me most nights with flashcards after Maggie's older cousin in spirit, Ray, would come by to watch a game with him, the two of them keeping their voices down, so I could concentrate on the next one. I passed all 4 sections on the first attempt, which our exam prep instructor told us happened for less than 15% of candidates, and by June 2021 I had my license. Ferris and Cole promoted me to assistant controller within 4 months of that, salary $68,000, and I started sitting in on meetings with the firm's biggest logistics clients, learning the operational side of the business in a way that would matter enormously later, though I had no idea yet how much. Daniel, that same year, made a decision that surprised even me. He'd been managing operations at the warehouse for 2 years, and Hector, still running his auto shop, had been quietly expanding. 2 new Bay additions, a growing fleet contract with a regional delivery company, and he offered Daniel a position as general manager of the whole operation, salary $64,000 with a profit-sharing clause that, in a good year, could add another $15,000 to $20,000 on top. Daniel took it. Working for Hector felt different than working for a warehouse conglomerate. It felt like working for family, because by then, that's exactly what Hector and Patricia were to us. We bought our first house in September 2021. It wasn't large, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a small backyard with an old maple tree, on a quiet street called Foxglove Court, purchase price $214,000, with a down payment of $28,000 that represented every dollar we'd saved for over 2 years, plus a small gift from Susan, $3,000, sent with a card that said, "For the house. I'm so proud of you both." It was the first money either of us had ever accepted from anyone on the Hargrove side of the family, and Daniel debated for 2 full days before depositing that check, worried it would feel like a betrayal of the boundary he'd drawn with his parents. I told him Susan wasn't Richard, and love that shows up honestly doesn't need to be treated with suspicion just because it shares a last name with love that didn't. We closed on the house on a Tuesday afternoon, and that night we ate pizza on the floor of the empty living room because we hadn't bought furniture yet, the smell of fresh paint still faint in the hallway, moonlight coming in through curtainless windows because the blinds hadn't been delivered yet. Daniel looked around at the bare walls and said, "We did this. Just us." I didn't correct him to include Susan's contribution, small as it was, because I understood what he meant. We had built the frame of this life with our own hands, brick by brick, receipt by receipt, and there was something almost sacred about sitting in that empty room, knowing not 1 square foot of it had been paid for by anyone who'd once told him not to call. Year 4 brought the first real crack in the silence, though it wasn't the kind either of us expected. In March 2022, Diane's mother, Daniel's grandmother, a woman named Eleanor who had always been kind to me on the rare occasions I'd met her before the wedding, passed away at 89. Daniel found out through Susan, not through his parents, 3 days after the funeral had already happened. He wasn't invited. He wasn't even told in time to have the choice. I remember exactly where we were when Susan's call came in, Sunday afternoon. Maggie not yet born, Daniel out in the backyard on Foxglove Court trying to get the old maple tree's dead branches cleared before storm season, sawdust on his forearms, and his phone buzzing in his back pocket. He walked back inside pale, sat down at the oak table, and just said, "Grandma Eleanor died." The funeral was Thursday. 3 days gone by the time anyone thought to tell him, and even then it hadn't been Richard or Diane who thought to. It had been Susan, calling from her own guilt at the fact that nobody else had bothered. I watched something in him go quiet and hard for about a week after that, a different kind of grief than the wedding rupture had been, because this was a rejection dressed up as principle. This was simple, careless cruelty, the kind that costs nothing to avoid and happens anyway. There was no confrontation to point to, no single cruel sentence I could write down in the binder, just an absence. A woman he'd loved lowered into the ground without him standing there, because including him would have meant acknowledging he still existed to his own parents. He didn't reach out to Richard about it. He wrote Eleanor a private letter instead, one he never sent anywhere, just folded into an envelope and placed in my binder in the back, in a section that had nothing to do with proof or evidence, just grief that needed somewhere to live. I never read that letter. It wasn't mine to read. But I know he wrote 3 pages because I found the crossed-out first 2 drafts in the recycling bin, and I kept those too, not to use for anything, just because some part of me couldn't bring myself to throw away evidence of how much he still had left to say to a family that had stopped listening. Year 5, 2022 into 2023, is when my career took the turn that changed everything. Ferris & Cole was acquired by a larger regional logistics holding company called Meridian Freight Group in November 2022, and in the reorganization that followed, half of senior finance leadership was let go. I was not one of them. The acquisition announcement came on a gray Monday morning. All of us gathered in the main conference room while a Meridian executive I'd never met explained, in careful corporate language, what synergies meant for our department. I watched 3 colleagues I'd worked alongside for years get quietly walked out that same week, boxes under their arms, and I spent the following month barely sleeping, certain my name would be next on that list. Instead, Meridian's CFO at the time, a woman named Carol in Beswick who'd taken an interest in my work restructuring 3 of our largest client accounts during the transition, called me into her temporary office, still half unpacked, boxes stacked against one wall, and told me she'd been impressed by how I'd handled the chaos of the merger without losing a single client relationship. She recommended me for a newly created role, Director of Financial Planning and Analysis, salary $94,000, with a team of 6 reporting to me. I was 29 years old. I remember calling my mother from the parking garage after that meeting, sitting in my car with the engine off, and just laughing, this disbelieving laugh, because 6 years earlier I'd been living above a laundromat memorizing the smell of fabric softener, filling out job applications on a cracked laptop screen, and now I had a team, a title, and a corner office with a window that looked out over the Meridian corporate campus. Daniel's business with Hector kept expanding too. By early 2023, Hector's shop had grown into a genuine regional operation, 3 locations, a fleet maintenance contract with a mid-sized trucking company, and Daniel, now with an official title of Chief Operating Officer, had helped structure the whole thing financially, moving annual revenue from roughly $1.2 million when he joined to just under $3.4 million by the start of 2023. Hector gave him a 5% equity stake that year, unprompted, sliding the paperwork across the kitchen table one Sunday dinner and saying, "You build half of this with me. It's only right." Daniel's eyes went a little glassy reading that document, and I understood exactly why. Nobody in his own bloodline had ever handed him something and said those words. We had our daughter, Margaret, we call her Maggie, in July 2023, at 4:12 in the morning on the 14th, after 19 hours of labor at Ashcombe Regional. I remember the hospital room smelled like antiseptic and, faintly, the coffee Daniel had spilled on his shirt sometime around hour 11, and I remember Patricia showing up at 6 a.m. with a bag of tamales for the whole nursing staff because she said no baby should be born into a hospital where the nurses hadn't been fed properly. Hector waited in the lobby the entire night, even though there was nothing for him to do, because he said that's what you do for family. Neither Richard nor Diane knew Maggie had been born until, as far as I can tell, they saw that Ledger article 7 months later. That's how completely they had written us out of their lives by then. I was working 4 days a week by then in a hybrid arrangement Meridian allowed for directors with young children, and Daniel restructured his schedule at the shop to be home by 5 every day without fail, something he was fiercely, almost stubbornly committed to, bath time and bedtime story every single night unless work made it truly impossible. Neither Richard nor Diane sent a card when Maggie was born. Susan did, along with a small gift, a hand-knit baby blanket she said had taken her 3 months to make, cream-colored with a small embroidered M in the corner, and a note that read, "I hope someday this family finds its way back to whole. Until then, please know you always have me." I photographed that blanket for the binder too, not because it was evidence of anything painful, but because by then the binder had quietly become something else. Not just a record of harm, but a record of who had actually shown up. That October, on Maggie's 3rd month, we got our first real crack of contact from Diane directly. Not a call. A text sent to my phone, not Daniel's, which surprised me. "I heard you had a baby girl. Congratulations. I hope she's healthy." 9 words. No name signed. No question about seeing her. I stared at that message for probably 10 minutes before I showed Daniel, and he read it twice and just shook his head slowly and said, 9 years, and she still can't manage a full sentence with my name in it. I didn't respond to the text. I screenshotted it, dated it, and filed it under cold contact, page 14 by then. If this part of the story feels familiar to any of you, the years where the silence stretches so long it almost feels normal, where you build a whole life out of the wreckage and you're not even sure anymore if you want the door to reopen, stay with me, because this is where it starts to turn. By the start of 2024, 5 years almost exactly since the night on Cedar Street, our life bore almost no resemblance to the one Richard had predicted for us. We owned our home outright of any co-signers or family debt, valued by then at roughly $268,000 after 2 rounds of small renovations we paid for in cash. A new roof in 2022, a kitchen remodel in early 2023 that Daniel did most of the demo work for himself, evenings and weekends, just to save on labor costs. My salary at Meridian had climbed to $102,000 after a promotion to senior director that January, overseeing financial planning for the entire Eastern Operations Division, a role that put me in the room for decisions involving budgets in the tens of millions. Daniel's equity stake in Hector's business, now officially incorporated as Ruiz Fleet Solutions, was worth an estimated $180,000 on paper, with the company posting $4.1 million in annual revenue. We had over $60,000 in combined retirement accounts, a second car paid off in full, and a 2-year-old daughter who called Patricia Abuela without anyone ever having to ask her to, because that's simply who Patricia had become. None of that had come from Larkspur Lane. All of it had come from 2 people who refused to let a family's cruelty become the ceiling on what they were capable of building, and from a handful of others, Patricia, Hector, Susan, who had shown up when blood didn't. The seed of what would eventually bring the Hargroves back into our lives got planted almost by accident in February 2024, when a local business journal called the Ashcombe Ledger ran a feature on Ruiz Fleet Solutions as part of a series on regional small businesses that had thrived post-pandemic. A reporter named Grant Feliz had spent 2 afternoons at the depot interviewing Hector and Daniel, walking the floor, photographing the fleet bays, and the resulting article ran on page 11 of the Sunday edition, print circulation just under 9,000 but also posted in full on the paper's website. The article included a photo, Hector, Patricia, and Daniel standing in front of the main depot, arms crossed, smiling, with a caption underneath identifying Daniel as Chief Operating Officer and Equity Partner. The article mentioned the company's revenue figures, the $4.1 million posted the previous fiscal year. It mentioned the fleet contracts, 3 of them, spanning 2 counties. And it mentioned, almost in passing, one line buried in the 4th paragraph, that Daniel had built a life in Ashcombe with his wife, Bella, a senior finance director at Meridian Freight Group, and their young daughter. I didn't think much of it when it came out. It was a small regional paper, the kind of thing that gets shared around a local Facebook group and then forgotten within a week. A few of my coworkers at Meridian sent me screenshots with celebratory emojis, and Patricia had 3 physical copies framed and hung one in the depot's break room, one in her own kitchen, and mailed the 3rd to Susan in Columbus with a note that just said, "Thought you'd want this." I certainly never imagined that somewhere in Ashcombe, on a Tuesday afternoon in late February, Diane Hargrove would be sitting in the waiting room of her dentist's office on Maple Avenue, flipping absently through a stack of dog-eared magazines and local papers left out on a side table, and would stop cold on page 11 at a photograph of the son she hadn't spoken to in almost 5 years, standing in front of a company worth over $4 million, with a wife and a granddaughter she had never once met. I only learned the details of that moment much later, secondhand, filtered through the kind of small-town gossip network that eventually gets everything back to everyone eventually. A hygienist who knew Diane socially mentioned to a mutual acquaintance that Diane had asked to take the paper home with her, that she'd seemed unusually quiet for the rest of the appointment, distracted enough that the dentist had to repeat a question about her flossing habits twice. Whatever she felt sitting in that vinyl chair with the overhead fluorescent lights and the smell of mint prophylaxis paste in the air, I'll never know for certain. But I know what happened in the weeks after, because that part we lived through directly. If you've ever had someone reappear in your life right around the time you stopped needing them to, you already know where the story is headed. Stick with me, because part 3 is where the real reckoning begins. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold yet, but looking back now, that dentist's office waiting room is the precise moment the clock started running on everything that came next. The first sign that something had shifted came 11 days after the Ledger article ran, on a Saturday morning in early March 2024. I was in the kitchen making Maggie's oatmeal, and Daniel's phone lit up on the counter with a text from a number he hadn't seen in almost 5 years, saved once, long ago, under a contact name he'd never bothered to delete. Mom. The message read, "Saw the article about you and Hector's company. So proud of you, sweetheart. I hope we can talk soon." Daniel read it twice, set the phone face down on the counter, and went back to pouring coffee like nothing had happened. It took him almost 4 hours to respond that day, and when he finally did, it was a single line. "Hi, Mom." That was the crack. And once it opened, it didn't stay small. Over the following 6 weeks, contact came in waves, each one warmer and more insistent than the last. Diane texted twice more that first week, once asking about Maggie by name, which meant she'd learned it from somewhere, since neither of us had ever told her, and once suggesting, gently, that it might be time to let bygones be bygones, for the sake of the family. Richard didn't reach out directly until late March, and when he finally did, it wasn't a text. It was a voicemail, left on Daniel's phone at 8:47 on a Tuesday night, his father's voice sounding older than either of us remembered, saying, "Son, it's Dad. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I know I said some things I shouldn't have. I'd like the chance to make it right, if you'll let me." I saved that voicemail as an audio file the same night, transferred it to a flash drive, and added a transcript to the binder, dated, timestamped, filed under a new tab I created that week labeled Simply Reconnection. If you've ever had a family member show up right on schedule with your success and completely absent during your struggle, you already know the specific flavor of whiplash I'm describing. Let me know in the comments if this timeline sounds familiar to you, because I have a feeling it will. Daniel wanted to believe it was genuine. I understood why. 5 years is a long time to carry a wound, and some part of him, the part that had grown up in that house, that had once wanted nothing more than his father's approval, wanted desperately for this to be real remorse, a father finally recognizing what he'd thrown away. I wanted to believe it too, honestly, for Daniel's sake if nothing else. But I'd spent 5 years building a career on reading financial statements for a living, on learning to spot the difference between a company that looked healthy on paper and one that was quietly bleeding out beneath the surface. And something about the timing nagged at me in a way I couldn't quite let go of. We agreed to a first meeting in April 2024, Neutral Ground, a coffee shop called Brindle and Company in downtown Asheville. Not the Cracker Barrel off Route 9 that had been the family's default meeting spot for decades, and definitely not Larkspur Lane. I chose the location deliberately. Brindle and Company had opened only 2 years earlier, all reclaimed wood and exposed brick, the kind of place with no history attached to it for any of us, no old family booth, no waitress who'd known Richard for 20 years and might treat him like the man he used to be instead of the man he'd actually become. I wanted us meeting somewhere that belonged to no one's past. Richard and Diane arrived first, 7 minutes early, both dressed carefully, Richard in a blazer I recognized from Rotary Club functions, pressed to the point of stiffness, Diane in a soft cardigan, the color of oatmeal that looked deliberately unthreatening, the kind of outfit chosen specifically not to look like the outfit of a woman who once looked at my shoes like they were evidence against me. They both looked older than 5 years should account for. Richard's hair fully gray now where it had only been salted before, new weight around his middle, Diane with fine new lines bracketing her mouth that hadn't been there at the wedding rehearsal all those years ago. Daniel walked in behind me, and I watched Richard's face when he first saw his son. Something crossed it, quick and involuntary, that looked almost like relief, before he caught himself and reset into the composed expression he'd clearly practiced. For the first 10 minutes, the conversation was almost unbearably ordinary. They asked about Maggie, what she liked to eat, whether she was walking yet, whether she looked more like Daniel or me. They asked about the house on Foxglove Court. Careful, general questions, nothing pointed yet. Diane cried, briefly, dabbing at her eyes with a paper napkin from the dispenser on the table, saying, "We've missed so much. I just want to be a grandmother to that little girl before it's too late." Richard reached over and put his hand over hers on the table, a gesture of solidarity that struck me, even then as slightly theatrical, like he was aware of how it would look to anyone watching. It was a good performance. I want to be fair and say I don't think either of them thought of it as a performance in the moment. I think, in their own minds, they believed every word. But watching Richard's eyes move around the coffee shop, cataloging details, watching him ask Daniel, almost as an afterthought, "So this Ruiz fellow, he made you a partner? Real equity, or just a title?" That question told me more than anything else said that day. He wasn't asking out of pride. He was asking out of arithmetic. The real evidence came 3 weeks later, and it came to me in a way I never could have planned for. In early May, I was at a baby shower for a coworker's sister at a restaurant called the Willowmere downtown, seated at a long table near the back with 6 other women from Meridian, and Diane, it turned out, was 2 tables over with a group of women from her book club, celebrating someone's birthday, judging by the small cake with candles the server brought out partway through. None of them recognized me. I'd changed my hair from the long, plain style I'd worn at the wedding to a shorter cut, and 5 years of a director-level salary had changed my wardrobe enough that I no longer looked like the girl who used to fix her own alternator in a laundromat parking lot. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the restaurant had that particular kind of acoustics where sound bounces strangely off high ceilings and hardwood floors, and at one point, over the general noise of 24 conversations, Diane's voice rose slightly, clear as anything, cutting straight across the room to where I sat frozen with a fork halfway to my mouth. "Richard's talked to a lawyer about the trust," she was saying to the woman beside her, a woman I didn't recognize, gesturing with her wine glass in a way that suggested this wasn't the first time she discussed it that afternoon. "If Daniel comes back into the fold properly, there's a real conversation to be had about restructuring things before anything happens to either of us. It would be foolish not to plan for who actually has the means to look after the estate long term." The woman beside her said something I couldn't quite make out, something that made Diane laugh. A small, tight laugh with no real warmth in it, and Diane replied, loud enough that I heard every syllable, "Marcus isn't going anywhere with that sneaker business, sweetheart. We both know that." I sat very still for the rest of that baby shower, smiling at the right moments, cutting a slice of cake I didn't taste, and the second I got to my car in the parking lot, I wrote down every word I could remember while it was still fresh, time-stamped it, and texted Daniel to call me the moment he was free. He called 20 minutes later, and I told him everything. There was a long silence on the line before he said, quietly, "So this was never about missing me." I told him I didn't know that for certain, that people can want 2 things at once, love and leverage both, but that we needed to go into any further contact with our eyes open, because whatever this reconciliation actually was, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. That week, I did something I probably should have done back in April. I made an appointment with an estate and family law attorney in downtown Ashcombe, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand who Carol and Beswick had recommended after a completely unrelated conversation about corporate trusts. I brought the binder, the whole thing, 5 years of receipts and screenshots and voicemail transcripts, organized by tab, dated meticulously, and set it on her desk. She spent almost 40 minutes flipping through it before she looked up and said, "This is one of the most thorough records I've seen from someone who wasn't already in litigation. You've been building a case file without knowing you were building a case file." Priya explained, in plain terms, what mattered legally and what didn't. Richard's estate, as far as public records and casual conversation suggested, was likely worth somewhere between $1.8 million and $2.3 million once you accounted for the 3 hardware stores, the house on Larkspur Lane, and various investment accounts. Nothing enormous by national standards, but substantial for Ashcombe, and more than enough to matter a great deal to 2 sons with very different track records. She explained that unless there was an existing will or trust document naming specific beneficiaries, Ohio's intestacy laws would split everything evenly between Daniel and Marcus regardless of any personal relationship, which meant if Richard genuinely wanted to cut Daniel out or favor Marcus, he'd need an actual updated legal document to do it. And that conversely, if Richard was now suddenly interested in restructuring the trust, as Diane had put it, it likely meant a document already existed that currently favored Marcus, and Richard was reconsidering that in light of Daniel's new financial standing. "In plain English," Priya told me, closing the binder gently, "it sounds like your father-in-law is trying to figure out which son is a better bet before he finalizes anything. And it sounds like the article about your husband's company just moved the odds." I didn't share every detail of that meeting with Daniel right away. Some of it, frankly, I needed to sit with myself first. But I told him enough, that there was almost certainly an existing estate plan, that Richard's sudden interest in reconciliation lined up suspiciously well with a financial recalculation, and that whatever we did next, we needed to do it with total clarity about what was actually being offered and what was actually being asked for in return. The next contact came in late May, and this time it wasn't a call or a text. It was Diane showing up at our house on Foxglove Court, unannounced, on a Thursday afternoon while I was working from home and Daniel was still at the depot. She'd never been to that house. She didn't know the address until, presumably, Richard had looked it up through public property records, which told me something in itself about how deliberately this had all been considered. I opened the door to find her standing on our porch in a floral dress, holding a small gift bag, saying she'd been in the neighborhood and wanted to drop something off for Maggie. I let her in, not because I trusted her, but because Priya had told me, in no uncertain terms, that the worst thing I could do at this stage was refuse contact and hand them a narrative where I was the one keeping the family apart, that the family court of public opinion in a town like Ashcombe would side, without hesitation, with the grieving grandmother locked out by the cold daughter-in-law, regardless of the actual history. So I made tea, chamomile, the only kind we had in the cabinet, and I sat with my mother-in-law in my own living room for the first time in 5 years, on a couch she was seeing for the first time, in a house she'd never once been invited to before that day. I watched her eyes do exactly what Richards had done at the coffee shop, moving across the room, cataloging, though she was smoother about it than he'd been, folding her observations into the shape of polite conversation. She noted the new sectional we'd bought that spring, ran a hand along the arm of it and said, "This is lovely, is it West Elm?" She asked, almost too casually, stirring honey into her tea, whether the house was fully paid off yet, and when I told her we still carried a mortgage, but were well ahead of the original schedule, something in her expression tightened, just slightly, a flicker she likely didn't realize was visible, like she'd been hoping for a different answer, a bigger number, a cleaner picture of exactly how much we were worth. She asked about my role at Meridian, specifically about the size of the division I oversaw, specifically about whether the title came with real decision-making power or more of an advisory one, and I answered honestly, because I had nothing to hide and because I wanted to see exactly how far she'd take it. She asked whether Daniel's equity in Ruiz Fleet Solutions was the kind that could be sold, if needed, or more of a long-term thing, a question so specifically financial that it stopped sounding like small talk the moment it left her mouth. She asked, near the end of her visit, gently, almost offhandedly, if we'd started a college fund for Maggie yet, and when I said we had, a 529 account we'd been contributing to monthly since Maggie was 3 months old, she nodded slowly and said, "That's good. That's very good. Richard will be glad to hear you're both so responsible with money. Not glad to hear we loved our daughter. Glad to hear we were responsible with money." I noted the wording. I always noted the wording by then. She left 40 minutes later, gift bag delivered, a small knitted sweater for Maggie, genuinely sweet on its own, which was part of what made the whole visit so disorienting, and I stood in my kitchen afterward and understood with total clarity exactly what had just happened. That hadn't been a grandmother visiting a granddaughter. That had been due diligence. I called Priya again that evening and told her about the visit in detail. She said calmly, "It sounds like you're being appraised, Bella, and I think you already know that." I did know it. I'd known it. Somewhere underneath the part of me that still wanted to believe in the possibility of a real reconciliation, since the moment Diane asked about the college fund with that particular tone in her voice, the tone of someone doing quiet math. Daniel took the news harder than I expected, not because it surprised him, but because some small, stubborn part of him had been hoping, against every piece of evidence, that this time might be different. He sat at our kitchen table that night, the sturdy oak one, no wobble, and said, "I keep thinking about what Patricia said. Family is who shows up. They didn't show up when I needed them. They're showing up now that I don't. I didn't have anything to add to that. It was already the whole truth. We decided, together, not to shut the door entirely, but to open it only partway, and only on our terms. We agreed to a family dinner at our house in mid-June, Richard, Diane, and at Richard's specific request, Marcus as well, so we can finally be together as a full family again, as Diane had put it in a text that made my stomach turn a little more each time I reread it. I didn't fight the timing. Part of me, by then, wanted this conversation to happen in a controlled setting on our ground, where I could see clearly whatever was coming rather than have it ambush us somewhere unprepared. In the 2 weeks leading up to that dinner, I quietly gathered a few more pieces I thought we might need. I asked Priya to draft a short summary letter, nothing dramatic, just a plain factual accounting of a timeline, the cosign refusal, the wedding ultimatum, the 5 years of silence, the ledger article, the sudden reappearance, dated and organized the way only a lawyer can make a story sound undeniable. I printed a copy of that ledger article in full, the one Diane had first seen in the dentist's waiting room, and slid it into the binder's front pocket. And I found, digging through an old drawer, the original folded napkin I'd taken from Brindle and Company after that first coffee meeting in April, on which Richard, gesturing while he talked, had absently sketched a rough outline of numbers, his own handwriting, doing math on a napkin without realizing anyone was watching, columns that looked suspiciously like a comparison between two sons' net worth. I hadn't understood in the moment why I'd slipped it into my purse. I understood perfectly well by June. The dinner was set for a Saturday, June 15th, 2024, 6:30 in the evening. Daniel spent that morning mowing the lawn, more out of nervous energy than any real need for the yard to look presentable. I spent it going over the binder one more time, cover to cover, making sure every tab was in order, every date correct, every piece of paper exactly where it needed to be if this evening turned out to require it. Maggie napped through most of the afternoon, oblivious to the fact that in a few hours she'd be in the same room as grandparents who had spent the first year of her life pretending she didn't exist. In the 2 weeks leading up to that dinner, I found myself thinking often about the version of me who'd stood behind that kitchen door on Larkspur Lane 8 years earlier, casserole dish in hand, listening to Richard tell his son I'd bring him down to my level. That version of me hadn't had a binder, hadn't had a CPA license or a director's salary, or a lawyer named Priya Anand who returned calls within the hour. Hadn't known yet that the family threatening to erase her would, one day, be sitting in her own living room asking careful questions about her college savings account. I wasn't the same woman who'd set that dish down quietly so no one would hear the ceramic clink against the counter. I didn't need to hide anymore. I didn't need to be quiet anymore either. Daniel and I talked, that final week, about what we actually wanted out of the dinner, stripped of any performance on either side. He said he wanted the truth on the table, whatever it turned out to be, even if the truth was ugly. I told him I wanted the same thing, and that whatever happened, I wasn't going to let this family rewrite 5 years of history in real time just because they'd finally decided we were worth the effort. We agreed, quietly, without needing to say it out loud in so many words, that the binder would be within reach that night, on the side table by the couch, not brought out unless it needed to be. At 6:04 p.m., 26 minutes before they were due to arrive, I stood at our kitchen window and watched a silver Cadillac Escalade, the same model Richard had washed by hand every Sunday for as long as I'd known him, though this one looked newer, a recent upgrade, probably financed against the very estate Diane had been discussing at that restaurant, turn slowly onto Foxglove Court and roll to a stop in front of our house, early, before they were even expected. Richard sat behind the wheel for a long moment before opening the door, and I watched him straighten his jacket in the reflection of the car window, the way a man does before walking into a meeting he's already decided how he wants to win. Diane got out on the passenger side, smoothing her skirt, glancing up at our house, really looking at it, the 2-story colonial with the maple tree out front, the kind of house that told her everything Richard's napkin math had already suggested. And behind them, unfolding himself slowly from the back seat, came Marcus, 34 years old now, a little heavier than I remembered, wearing a jacket that looked expensive and slightly too tight, glancing around the quiet street with an expression I couldn't quite read yet. Not resentment exactly, not warmth either, something more complicated sitting underneath it that I wouldn't understand until later that night. I turned from the window, walked to the side table, and set the binder within reach, just in case. Then I went to open the door. Dinner started ordinary enough, in that same careful, rehearsed way the coffee shop in their head. I'd made roast chicken with rosemary potatoes, a meal I'd chosen specifically because it was the kind of thing that took all afternoon and gave my hand something to do while my mind ran through every possible version of how the evening might go. Richard complimented the house the moment he walked in, running a hand along the doorframe like he was checking the quality of the trim work, and complimented the smell coming from the kitchen. Diane held Maggie for the first time, kneeling down to her level in the entryway with a tenderness that looked, in the moment, entirely genuine, and I'll admit, watching her hold my daughter did something complicated to my chest, a small ache underneath the caution, because some part of me still wanted this to be simple, wanted a grandmother and a granddaughter to just get to have each other without any of the rest of it attached to money or motive. Marcus brought a bottle of wine, a decent one, $34 according to the sticker he forgot to peel off, and made a joke about Daniel's new haircut that almost, sounded like the old easy rhythm brothers are supposed to have, the kind of rhythm I'd never actually gotten to witness between them because by the time I'd entered the picture, that rhythm had already curdled into something else. For about 40 minutes, sitting around our dining table, passing serving dishes, refilling water glasses, it almost felt like nothing had ever happened, like 5 years of silence could really just dissolve over roast chicken and a decent bottle of wine, if everyone simply agreed not to mention it. Then Richard set down his fork, cleared his throat in that particular way I remembered from every family gathering I'd ever half-witnessed from the outside, and said, "I want to talk about the future. All of us, together as a family." He looked at Daniel. "I've been meeting with my attorney about updating the estate plan. I think it's time we handled things properly, as a family that's whole again." Daniel, to his credit, didn't flinch. "What does properly mean, Dad?" Richard glanced at Diane, then back at Daniel and said, "It means making sure everything is fair. Making sure the person best positioned to carry the family forward is properly accounted for." He said it smoothly, like a line he'd practiced, and I watched Marcus's jaw tighten slightly across the table, the first real crack in his easy brother performance of the evening. "Best positioned," Daniel repeated. "You mean whoever has the most money now?" "That's not what I said," Richard replied, and his voice sharpened just slightly, the first hint of the man from Cedar Street showing back through the careful reconciliation mask. I reached over to the side table and set the binder on my lap, though I didn't open it yet. "Richard," I said, keeping my voice level, "can I ask you something? When did you first talk to your attorney about restructuring the trust?" He hesitated, just half a second too long. "Sometime this year." "Was it before or after the Ledger article ran in February?" The table went quiet. Diane's hand, still holding Maggie's small fingers, went still. Marcus looked down at his plate. Richard's face did something complicated. Not quite panic, but a recalculation, the look of a man realizing the conversation had already left the rails he'd planned for it. "I don't see what that has to do with anything," he said. I opened the binder to the page I'd marked, the transcript of the restaurant conversation, dated, time-stamped, and I read it back word for word, calm, without theatrics, the way I'd present a variance report at a Meridian board meeting. "If Daniel comes back into the fold properly, there's a real conversation to be had about restructuring things. It would be foolish not to plan for who actually has the means to look after the estate long-term." I looked up. Diane said that to a friend at the Willowmere in early May. I was 2 tables away. I didn't go looking for it. It found me. Diane's face went pale, then flushed, a quick, mortified color rising in her cheeks. "That's not, I was just talking." "People talk." "I know," I said. "That's exactly the problem. This wasn't a private thought you kept to yourselves while you figured out how to say it kindly to us. This was already a plan, being discussed casually, over lunch, while we were still deciding whether to trust you again." Richard's composure cracked further. "You have no right to sit there and lecture me about family loyalty," he said, his voice rising now, the old authority creeping back into it, the tone he'd used the night he told Daniel not to call the house again. "I am trying to fix this. I am trying to bring my family back together, and you're sitting here with a folder like you're building a case against me." "I am not building a case against you," I said. "I already have one. I've had one for 5 years. I just never needed to use it until you decided the timing worked in your favor." I set the folded napkin from Brindle and Company on the table, smoothing it flat so everyone could see Richard's own handwriting. 2 columns, roughly sketched, one labeled with a rough estimate of Daniel's net worth based on what he'd learned from the Ledger article, the other with a much smaller figure beside Marcus's name, and beneath both underlined twice, a dollar figure that matched almost exactly the number Priya had estimated for the total estate. Richard stared at it for a long moment. His hand actually reached toward it, then stopped, like he understood that touching it would only confirm what everyone at the table already knew. "You did math on a napkin," Daniel said quietly, "before you ever said a word to me about wanting to reconnect." Nobody spoke for a moment. Maggie, in Diane's lap, babbled something happily oblivious, and the ordinary sweetness of that sound against the tension in the room almost broke something loose in my chest. Marcus was the one who spoke next, and when he did, his voice sounded different than it had all evening, smaller and much more honest, none of the easy joke rhythm left in it. "He's been talking about this since the article came out," he said, looking at his father, not at us, his hands flat on the table like he needed something solid to hold on to. I told him it looked bad, reaching out right after finding out how much Daniel's worth now. He said it didn't matter how it looked, as long as the family ended up whole. He looked at Daniel then, and something raw crossed his face, the kind of expression I imagine had been sitting underneath a decade of forced confidence and failed businesses. "I've spent 9 years watching them treat every failure of mine like it was temporary, and every success of yours like it was a threat," Marcus said. "Every time one of my businesses fell apart, Dad would say, 'Next time, son, you'll figure it out,' like failure was just a phase I was passing through. Every time you did something right, passed an exam, got a promotion, bought a house, it was like the room got colder. I used to think that meant they loved me more. I don't think that anymore. I think it just meant I was easier to control. A son who keeps needing rescuing never gets the chance to walk away." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he looked down at his hands like he was surprised at himself for saying any of it out loud. Richard's face at that did something I hadn't expected, a flicker of real fear, quick and unguarded, gone almost as fast as it appeared. The look of a man watching the two sons he'd spent 30 years pitting against each other suddenly, for the first time, seeing each other clearly instead of through the lens he built for them. "Marcus," he said, quieter now, "that's not fair." "Isn't it, though?" Marcus said. It was a Tuesday evening in April this year, a little past 6, the kind of early spring evening where the light goes soft and gold right before dinner, and I was in the kitchen helping Maggie, 3 years old now, mix pancake batter for dinner because she'd requested breakfast for dinner, and neither Daniel nor I had the energy to argue. Flour dusted across the counter. Maggie standing on a step stool with a whisk nearly as big as her arm when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Richard Hargrove standing on our porch in a coat that hung off him, 2 sizes too big. A coat I didn't recognize, the kind you buy secondhand or borrow from someone, dark green, missing a button near the collar. He'd lost weight. His face looked older by more than the 18 months that had actually passed, hollowed out in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the specific exhaustion of watching something you built your whole identity around come apart in slow motion. His hands, when he lifted one in a small, uncertain wave, were shaking slightly, and not, I understood immediately, from the cold. Behind him, at the curb, sat not the silver Escalade but an older sedan I didn't recognize, the kind of car a man drives after he's had to sell the one that meant something. "Bella," he said, "I know I have no right to be here. I need to talk to Daniel. He stopped, swallowed, and something in his face crumbled in a way I had genuinely never seen on him before, not even at the dinner table 10 months earlier. "I need $60,000, or I'm going to lose the house." I didn't gloat. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think it would be easy, hearing the story, to want that moment to feel like a victory, and it didn't. It felt like watching gravity finally catch up with something that had been suspended in the air for a very long time. I called Daniel to the door. He came, saw his father standing there, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "Here's what I know for certain, and here's the one line I want you to take away from all of this, if nothing else sticks. A family that only shows up when you have something to offer was never actually protecting you in the first place. It was managing an asset, and the moment the asset stops paying out, you find out exactly how much of the love was real." Daniel didn't slam the door. That's not who he is, and it never has been. He told his father, gently, that he wasn't going to hand over $60,000, but that he'd help him find a housing counselor and look at options for restructuring what remained of the business debt, because that was something he could offer without rescuing a pattern that had cost us both years of our lives. He told him Marcus was doing well, steady, on his own 2 feet for the first time, and that maybe it was worth asking him how he'd managed it. Richard cried on our porch that evening, an old man in a coat too big for him, and for the first time in 8 years, I believe every tear was real. We didn't let him in that night. Some doors, once you've rebuilt your life on the other side of them, you don't reopen just because the person on the other side is finally sorry. But we did leave a door open for Marcus, who calls Maggie every other Sunday now, who drove down for her 3rd birthday with a gift he'd actually thought about instead of one his mother had picked out for him, who told Daniel, last month, over coffee, just the two of them, that he was finally starting to understand what it might have felt like to be loved without a condition attached. If you've made it this far with me, thank you. Genuinely. This story took me a long time to be ready to tell, and I think the real lesson in it isn't about revenge, because I never wanted revenge. Not once. Not even at that dinner table with the binder open in my lap. The lesson is simpler than that. Build something real, with people who show up for you before you're impressive, not after. Keep your receipts, literally and figuratively, not because you're waiting to use them as a weapon, but because someday you'll need to know, with total clarity, exactly what happened and exactly who was there for it. And when the people who once told you that you'd bring them down to your level come back around once your level changes, you get to decide, calmly, on your own terms, exactly how much of yourself you're willing to hand back to them. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what you would have done on that porch. I read every single one of them, and I'll see you in the next story.